you watched my talk with Scott Ritter about the defense budget and all of that. What's your point on that? You mentioned something before coming up. What was your point on that talk?
Well, he picked up on my point that I've been making 50 years ago, that there's a great difference between America and the balance of payments effect of America's military spending and other countries. Ever since the Korean War broke out in 1950, the entire balance of payments deficit for the United States from the 50s, 60s, and the 70s has been military spending abroad. The private sector, trade and investment is exactly in balance over all these years. I published all of these statistics first for Arthur Andersen and then in my book Super Imperialism. And immediately when my book Super Imperialism came out, Herman Kahn hired me for the Hudson Institute and said the largest buyers of the book were the State Department and the military, the CIA and the military. Immediately, the military gave a contract to the Hudson Institute for me to explain how going off the gold standard essentially enabled the United States to fund its balance of payments deficit, meaning its military spending abroad, by pumping dollars into the global economy and having these dollars end up in foreign central banks and be recycled. Well, what that meant is that America's whole military spending for the last 50 years depends upon the dollarization system and other countries using dollars as their monetary reserves in place of gold and instead of their own currencies. That means that as they move away from the dollars, there's no way that the United States can finance its 800 military bases abroad and its military spending. Russia doesn't have this problem. The military generals don't study the balance of payments. And many of them are right-wingers that have a sort of crude, monetarist, Chicago school, neoliberal view of money without understanding that money is debt. And specifically, monetary reserves are not only America's treasury debt, but the monetization of America's military spending. Now, what Scott pointed out is that Russia doesn't have this problem. China doesn't have this problem because they're not trying to create a foreign empire. They're not trying to put military bases in other countries where they have to somehow spend their domestic currency and buying local currencies which to do whatever military operations do there. So they don't have the constraints that the United States have. And that's what's essentially leading the United States to say, we're not only at war with Russia and China militarily, we're at war with them financially. We don't want the BRICS, China, Russia, Iran, and their other countries, to have an alternative of not using the dollar so that the dollars that we spend abroad for all these military operations are going to be somehow recycled to the United States. That's why you're having Trump try to browbeat India, Japan, Korea, Europe into somehow promising to recycle all the dollars to the United States. Why is he doing this? It's not simply to pay tariffs so that the Treasury will have more money and can cut taxes on the wealthy even more. It's so that the dollar will not be forced down, so that there will be a huge inflow to support the dollar, basically, despite Trump's hope of devaluing the dollar slightly, slowly downwards, to as if that's going to make American exports more competitive. The whole fight over the dollar isn't really about U.S. exports being more competitive, because the United States doesn't have much industry to export. It's really about the balance of payments, which is primarily military in character, not the trade deficit, not the investment deficit. And that's what's the government used to realize that. But again, Trump and his team just think of sort of running a protection racket. Either you spend your money to the United States, 350 billion from you, Japan. You promise to send here to invest another 350 billion from you, Korea, or we're just going to raise tariffs and deny you the U.S. market. The American strategy, and it's a military strategy as well as an economic strategy, imagines that other countries need the American market and they don't have a choice but to support the dollar. And by supporting the dollar, supporting America's ability to wage war and have military operations abroad. They don't realize that this is the whole thing, and yet this protection racket has essentially overplayed its hand. And last week, Korea said, "Wait a minute, you just told Japan to pay you 350 billion, and you get all the profits from what they spend in. You get 90% of the profits, and give us 10% if there are any profits at all. From the way you arrange it with your Hollywood Pentagon bookkeeping, so that it's just you need America's market. We can deny it, and that's chaos for you." Well, it's not really chaos. They tried the same thing with China last week, and China protested and said, I'm sorry, they tried it with Korea, not Korea last week. Korea protested, and they said, "We're not Japan. We don't have 350 billion. We're much smaller. And you're blocking our automobile exports from the U.S. market. We just can't pay." And then Lutvak, Howard Lutvak, the Commerce Secretary, said, "The Koreans either accept the deal or pay the tariffs. Black and white, pay the tariffs or accept the deal." Well, yesterday, Korea's foreign minister went to China, and there's not a word in the paper about what they're discussing, but you can just imagine. Korea realizes that Trump is going to insist, we need your money to continue our military spending abroad and to finance our budget deficit. We're going to close the market to you. And Korea finally is saying, well, for Hyundai and for its computer, Samsung, all of its computer industries, well, what if we don't have the U.S. market? Do we have a plan B? And I suspect they're talking about China. And they're talking to China, and they're saying, well, if we walk away from the U.S. market, we'll walk away from that factory in Georgia. That it's obviously there's such a reaction in Korea that we can't afford it. If we walk away, can you figure a way that we can work our industrial capacity in partnership with you as part of your Chinese new prosperity sphere? And by the way, if we do that, will you help us back us up when we tell the Americans to leave their military bases here? We don't want their military bases, is if they're going to hold us up and essentially declare we're treating you like a defeated power, like we defeated you in 1951. There's never really been an end to the Korean War. We're still fighting you, just like we're still fighting World War II against Japan. You don't have a choice. What if Korea and Japan and India all make a choice to say, well, we cannot afford to access to the U.S. market on these terms. We can use the $350 billion, or Japan can use the same amount. We can use that $350 billion to subsidize our own industry and keep our employment and support our workforce while we transition the radical change from orienting our trade with the United States and Europe to orienting it with our own Asian new partners. That's what it all is, and that commercial balance of payments consideration is a fundamental military consideration at the root, and that's what really frightens the United States. It was the Vietnam War that forced the United States off gold in 1971. Its spending in Vietnam depleted the gold stock by spending so many dollars abroad that General de Gaulle in France and Germany just cashed them in for gold, and America finally just stopped the drain. Well, now it's other countries that are preventing the United States from solving this drain problem by saying we're not going to accept any dollars that are just the monetization of your military spending to surround us with military bases. We're going to stop the financial bloodstream that's funding your whole new Cold War. And this is not goes beyond the investment in missiles, the investment in boats. Other countries are not going to fight a war by invading any other country. And America cannot control another country, not even Ukraine, without troops invading it. And the cost of a military invasion, infantry invasion, is very different from the domestic cost of sending missiles. China and Russia, Iran have no intention or ability to mount an army to send into other countries. All they have is missiles, basically, and that's what the next few years of war are going to be all about.
Yeah. Go ahead, Richard.
Okay, another way of saying this is that the United States cannot afford the empire. The problem is it can't do it. In the early decades after World War II, the balance of payments, correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, saw export surplus from the United States, generating the capital, the money with which then to finance the 700 or 800 bases around the world. And so you had the rest of the world dependent on exports from the United States, having to pay for them in the money that was then used to subordinate them militarily to keep this game going. By 1970s, this game was over because the Germans, the Japanese, the Europeans had recovered from the war, as we knew they would. That's what they were doing in the decades from 1945 to 1975. In that 30-year period, the United States lost its preeminent position in the world economy as an exporter. It would either have had to stop because it could no longer finance its military adventures abroad by its export surplus, or it would have had to do what Michael so nicely described. It would have to have found another way, and the dollarization, making all oil contracts denominated in dollars, and hyping the threat of the Soviet Union, which the Europeans are copying today because they don't know any other politics. This was enabling them to then create the deficit program. They would make the United States a net importer, switch its own production out of the country, no longer needing these exports, no longer being able to afford them. They weren't profitable enough to produce in the United States. And you replaced all the workers either with machinery and with automation or by exporting the jobs. So your end result was the story Michael just told. You could continue to finance your global military adventures, but now you finance them by means of imposing, if you like, on the world the need to hold reserves for their currency, because the agreed relationship among currencies was gone. That's what we had coming out of the Bretton Woods, and that's what we ended when Nixon took us off the gold standard in 1971. So then you have Michael's story. But let me do something we don't do enough of. Let me tell you a little bit on this program about the limits to all of this. In order to sustain now, when you have no exports, and when the ability of the United States to import is shrinking every day because the mass of our people are simply too poor. I mean, the statistic came out this week that the top 10, if I have it right, the top 10% of the income distribution accounts for 50% of the consumer demand in our society. All right, that's another way of saying that the bottom 90% are piss poor. They can't afford anything, right? Well, given that we depend on imports, that's not a good basis for the future. We're not going to be able to run the kind of deficits that we used to. That's my guess at this point. All right, what then is going to sustain the story Michael told? How are we going to pay for all of those bases? We don't have the exports to do it, and we're not running the kinds of deficits, nor is the rest of the world eager to accumulate dollars in the way that they were before. And that was true before BRICS became important. The decline of the dollar as a reserve currency is at least 30 years old. The Chinese once had 1.2 trillion. They have 750 billion. I know these are big numbers, but that's a big decline. It's not surprising, but it's a big decline. And so for me, I'm beginning to wonder, how long can you keep this up? And when you add the degree to which military payments in this country are a Keynesian support of aggregate demand in our society, then you see he can't afford a military, but he can't afford not to have the military. And I suspect that's the reason why Mr. Trump, who comes into office promising to stop the endless wars, has neither stopped them, nor has he been able to avoid proliferating more war. He attacked Iran, and he's busily now provoking Venezuela and taking extraordinary steps to do it. And giving carte blanche to Mr. Netanyahu is extraordinary. You know, we wonder, why would a government do these extraordinary things? And in a way, Michael's story gives the beginning of an answer, that there's more going on here than macro management. That's important. And there's more going on than balance of payments. That's important. There's also managing the military, the budget, and the activity when you're so badly out of whack. You can't beat the Russians in Ukraine. That's what's obvious. It's obvious to the whole world. They can't let go. What's the matter here? Even in Vietnam, they understood we've been defeated, and the Americans withdrew, and the Communist Party of Vietnam took over and has remained the government ever since. That's 35 years ago, right? Or what is it now? Maybe more than that, 50 years ago.